And boom, we are live. Hello and welcome everybody to a very early morning edition of the Wide World of Warhammer for us Australians, but maybe not too bad for you guys. With the one and only Pumba. How you doing, buddy?
Hello, thank you for having me. Super
No
excited to
worries.
be here.
No worries at all. No worries at all. It's been a little while. I think 9 months or so since we last chatted, but a little couple of things have happened since then. You guys just went and won the WTC. Poland's never done that before, right? No.
I mean, it's been 9 years, to be honest. It's been in the making.
That is quite a while. That is quite a while. Does it feel real? Does it feel? I guess something. I don't know. Does it feel real? This is an actual question.
Yeah, I think enough time has passed that it definitely feels real now.
Yeah.
It also feels like it's a gone thing, and now we're working towards the next WTC, which always happens every single year. That as soon as the one finishes, the preparations for the next one begin. But yeah, I'm definitely still have that feeling of doing the victory lap and just having the possibility to share my opinions as gospel and do some absolute bullshit takes, which I very much enjoy.
Oh, don't we all love? Don't we all love? And well, look, those tattoo bets have mostly been paid up, so you can see some ink on some people's skin, which of course it makes sense, and you love it, right? You gotta love to see that. So the victory has been cemented, which is great. So yeah, fantastic, and obviously still a little way to go till WTC, but it almost feels like it's just around the corner. So very, very exciting. So I guess today we're going to talk about scrims. So obviously a term that's used, I guess, colloquially across esports, in real life sport, and the Warhammer sphere. And so I wanted to talk to Pumba about, I guess, Team Poland and how they do scrims, and as well as himself locally with other international events and national events. So I guess for you, Pumba, what's a scrim in your eyes? And for the listeners who've never heard of the term scrim or scrimmage, what the hell does it mean? What is it?
So scrims, when we talk about them, we mainly refer to the process of international teams, maybe not international teams, but teams in general. Teams 40K is what we focus on over here. And basically doing a sparring match between us. We do preparation for them. We build lists specifically for them. We build team comps. Then we pair each other just like we would at the WTC or any other big team event. And then we play our games. Instead of doing it offline, let's say, and on the board, we usually would use TTS, which is Tabletop Simulator, and some other additions to basically do them online and have the possibility to play players and people from across the globe without having the need for traveling, right? Which is a huge thing. So it's not the same as playing an 8v8 in person. It never will be, but it's a great tool. It is something that is used in many different ways when designing your roster, building a team for WTC or any other event, or maybe just testing out the meta in general.
Yeah, sure. That's a great summary. And you just touched on there, it's not the same as in person. So obviously alluding that a lot of the time it's done by a tabletop simulator. Look, unfortunately, we don't all live door to door as next door neighbors. We have to perform these things online and stuff like that. But have you done in-person scrims generally as well? Does that happen or not as much?
I think the closest to in-person scrimmage we've come, especially as Team Poland, would be doing something like a boot camp, which we do every so often, couple of months, 3 months apart. And then we try to, if there is enough people to do that, we sometimes would divide them into 2 teams, for example, and then organize such a scrim with doing with the pairing process, with preparing the tables, stuff like this. So scrims like in person, I think this is the closest. It's not always the same as well, as you don't. Sometimes you don't have enough people to do something like that. Sometimes the armies would repeat throughout the people attending, which of course you cannot do in normal teams 40K format. But generally, that's close enough to doing something like this in person. Yeah.
Yes, sweet. So, how often do you guys perform a scrim? Obviously, it's a big ordeal, like talking to, I guess, another country and stuff like that. How often would you guys try to do one, generally?
So, since I want to say November, maybe even October, we've had 2 international scrims a month. and it's still going, and it's going to be basically happening till WTC. So it's an incredible amount of games, and incredible amount of people who have applied for the national team are participating in them.
Yeah, wow, that's quite a bit of work. And obviously, I know you guys have a bit of a pool of players, so it's not the same 8 players going over and over and over again. But maybe there's some absolute fiends who love it and just want to do it. So I guess, is this something that Team Poland has always done, or is this something that has been sort of recently implemented?
I think it began somewhere. I want to say 2001, something like this. In the COVID times, where TTS actually grew in popularity because in-person 40k was practically dead, and we still needed a way to prepare for upcoming events and possibly WTC if it were going to happen, right? Back then, it was mainly arranged through some old ETC forums, and we just talked to the representatives, the captains, or whatever of different national teams if they would just like to do a scrim. Since then, it's grown a huge amount. There's definitely plenty of countries doing the scrims. It's very easy to find opponents and schedule with them. So it's grown in popularity across the WTC team landscape, I would say.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, I know, like you said, like a bunch of countries have adopted this new philosophy of doing scrims and stuff like that. And it's not, I guess, very different to, I know, recently I've just gone through like a old YouTube history of like esports. Like my background was like Call of Duty. I loved it for so long. And hearing about like competitive teams, they scrim against each other all the time leading up to big major events. And it's a very similar approach in a lot of ways. So I guess my question is, what differs like a scrimmage for you guys versus like a regular tournament or practice game? So is there a different set of parameters that are set around it for you guys, or is it basically the same thing?
It's different in many, many ways. So the most important thing is understanding that the result isn't actually the goal, right? There is no stakes. It's not a tournament. We aren't necessarily going for a win no matter what, like I would say. So sometimes we would use these to test new players, test new concepts, test army, just stress test the meta in any ways. And the results are very much secondary to what we learn through them, right? Whereas when going to a tournament, of course, the goal is to win the tournament. So the mentality around the scrims is definitely hugely different.
Oh, sorry, just some good old internet lag. Sorry, sorry, didn't quite catch you there. That's okay. I'm sure you explained it perfectly. And
close enough.
Close enough. So you said so to test players, to test armies, to stress test and things. So how do you? So with a scrim, do you like limit the variables you test, or you just go hog wild and test all of them at the same time? Because I know it can be pretty hard when you test like a bunch of different variables. So, look, obviously right now, new balancer, say new meta. Look, Drukari's nice and cool. Like we want maybe to stress test it, but then we've got a new player as well. Do you try and test them all at the same time, or like do you like say, look, I'm going to put all my experienced players playing and then stress test the army so we have a good idea?
Yeah, it varies depending on what time it is, right? If it is a developed meta that we already know, it might be after data slate meta like we are in now. And definitely limiting some factors as variables is happening. We would oftentimes, when testing new players, pick out a team of 8 through picking 4 prospects of the national team, and for example, 4 veterans, right? So we know the 4 people who we are testing with are on the national team level because they've been to WTC/ETC in the past. So we already know the quality of the player. Now we can, for example, test just the army and how it performs in the pairing process and on the table itself, right? Whereas when we would test new players, for example, we would have them. Usually, it's all dependent on the specific player, of course. So generalizing here, we would give them something more meta-like that we know is good, and or some crazy. It might also be a crazy idea that they have specifically have to test if their ideas actually make sense on the table and in practice, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You got to test them out some way, right? So that makes a perfect sense in a scrimmage scenario, as well as like practice games and stuff like that to get a feel for how things will go. So I guess just to sort of break that down a bit further. So for new players, like there's a bunch of new people who are keen on WTC and looking to join and get involved and stuff like that and join their respective country teams. So how would you go about like stress testing some new players in a scrimmage scenario? Like what's the general process that you follow?
So that's a very complex question, and it also varies from scrim to scrim. As many of these, as we have 2 a month, which is a huge workload on especially the people selecting the team and like doing the pairings and captaining the team for the specific scrim, we share those responsibilities. So I would get some pairing, like some responsibility in a sense of I would build a team for a specific team that we are scrimming against. Say Scotland was one of the teams I was the captain for, and then we decide if we wanna what do we want to do here, right? As like a general, what's our goal for this specific scrim? Based on that talk that we have with like selectors and other people in the team, we would then do something like pick the 8 that are coming to build a cohesive team comp as well, which sometimes is difficult. You don't necessarily want to like throw people on your armies for these. Maybe you sometimes do. So as you can see, I'm like jumping around with different answers because it's very hard to generalize something that is very complex in that sense. I think the closest I can give you the answers that is closest to like being cohesive here is it's very player dependent, and like you would take a person who is applying for the team, and you would judge him in terms of his preparation for the scrim. So how much time does he spend developing his list, playing some practice games? Then one of the most important aspects of Team 40K, doing the estimations, huge thing, analyzing people's lists, actually being able to come up with an estimation table that is cohesive and is basically representative of what's going to happen is a huge. And then of course the actual game and how the person performs during the game, right? We cannot watch every single one of those games, but we try to at least get a peek of as many as possible, or like the most important ones for us.
Yeah, sure. And when you just say the most important ones for you, imagine that if from a player perspective, maybe the newer players, like for example, like look, Typhus or your Doodads, like look, we know how they're going to go. They're good players. We don't need to watch them as much unless it's like a new faction or an interesting matchup to play. Whereas maybe a new faction or a new player, you generally want to focus that. Or if someone else has brought something quite interesting, I imagine that's when you'd want to watch those. Is that my correct understanding?
That's very much correct. Yes.
Yeah, sweet. That's awesome. I guess a quick question there. So talking about factions a bit. So obviously, we're now in a new data slate meta, so everything's up for grabs. But in the previous data slate meta, when you're going for scrims, would you generally sort of like tailor your lists and take maybe things that are quite well known? Oh, cool. Oh, sorry. Avoid taking things which are quite well known. So, for example, like Triple Knight Spinner Elder or MSU CSM, would you actually deliberately not include them in your 8 because we know what they're going to look like? We know what they like, we know how they test, and for the meta we're trying to test for, which is in the future, we wouldn't even be playing them. Would you like deliberately avoid them, or would you still include them as it's valuable data?
It's a good question, and as with almost everything that we are talking about, I would say it depends on the goal, as I've discussed previously, right? So the reason to not take those like very well known and established armies would be they give us no information of actually like no information about the army, about the meta, how it performs. It is already a known factor. However, that known factor is also what might benefit us if you want to test the extent of a specific player. We know that somebody is has a potential for the national team, for example, right? We can see that in the way he thinks, he plays, he clearly has some potential of joining the national team. And he's been playing some garbage faction. It happens, right? You're maining, I don't know, Admech, let's say, right now. And it's not exactly a top 8 pick in the terms of team composition. So what we might do is actually decide that this player for the next, I don't know, a month, for example, will just practice. Let's use the CSM, for example, right? So he would be required to switch to that army. We know that the army is ridiculously strong. It has great potential to score big. And now we can actually see if that player playing that strong army can perform and deliver, right? So it's very dependent. Sometimes we have the scrims where we want to test some wild concepts and we don't take anything that's actually meta. Usually we mix things up. So we would take some fun, have some nice foundations in terms of veterancy in the team or like army choices, and then we test some wild stuff as well on top of that. Because if you go all out, it usually happens that, I mean, some things just don't work out, which is fine, and we never want to position our opponents in a place where they think we are, I don't know, trolling with our list or something like that. So we always take these into account as well, that even though this is testing, we try to keep it very it is also about performing well, right? So we want to share that respect for other teams.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's completely fair because obviously, look, they're giving up their time, and look, obviously, their opposing team is getting some benefit out of it. But if you guys are just going to throw and troll the whole thing, then in the future, that team or country may say, "Nah, fuck you guys, I don't want to scrim in the future," and that's a valuable practice partner which you lost that opportunity to. So it makes sense you don't want to troll. You can control those variables. And in discussing those variables, were you generally before a scrim like, hey, so organize with Team Scotland, we can figure out some times and stuff like that? Will you guys talk about, hey, what we want to test and what we want to theorize, if that's possible, or not really? Like, you'll just sort of let it happen?
It also is dependent. So yes, before most of these, the selectors would have like goals for a scrimmage. Some of these, as I've discussed, have been, for example, captained by people who have never captained an 8-player team before. That's also something that we can test during those scrims, like the possibility of developing new team captains, people responsible, like head coaches, people responsible for the pairings process. These are all skills that are also required in a team, and you can also develop them during the scrims. So yes, there's definitely that. Sometimes, though, it must be said, there is 5 tournaments coming up. There is nobody has any time from like free time from work, and sometimes you would just pick an 8-man team and perform as best as you can, given the circumstances. Right? I'm just gonna be honest here. Life is life, and we still do that as a hobby. So sometimes things just don't work out as well as you would like to.
Unfortunately, that is true. So yeah, that makes complete sense. So I guess so previously, so obviously we talked about Team Poland a lot, but do you do this locally as well for like your own local teams or 5-mans or outside of Team Poland? Like do scrims and stuff like that?
So definitely not as often. It is also a factor of developing and applying for the national team that you don't have as much time for something like my local team, which I'm very fond of, and I love all of these guys, and I try to play as many tournaments with them as I can and practice with them as often as I can. But it unfortunately is the truth that it kind of takes a second plan. I think you would say that. We have done, for example, with my local team, I have done a scrim against Team No Name from France, which has people like Alexandre Sacco, the winner of LGD, and my good friend. So yes, these happen, definitely less often than the national scrims. Naturally, the local teams that are not as serious, I would call them. Serious is a big word, but sure. are not also as organized, so it usually can take a longer time for these stuff like this, right? But these definitely can happen, and we've done some in the past.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. Well, obviously the priority is Team Poland as a whole. And also, so obviously at the time of recording, this is before Pyra Cup. I know it seems like quite a big event for a lot of big national teams. So, I guess my question is, will you guys? So now that Pyra Cup's just around the corner, will you sort of like shut off all external scrims so people don't get, I guess, a heads up of what you're taking, or will you still be open to doing scrims as long as I guess the WTC is probably the big priority, right? Like of sharing information there.
So, Power Cup, as you've said, is coming up. It's a huge event for us in many ways, but it is also a practice event. It is, everybody's going there to win. It's going to be a huge competition. It's going to be awesome. And everybody's literally like just going ham in practice. But it is a kind of practice event for WTC. It's still the ultimate goal is winning the WTC, not the Pyro Cup. With that in mind, we have not stopped doing the international scrims. We currently have one with Ireland and Norway, so teams who are not coming to Pyro, for example, which is, I mean, the information probably gets shared around, but depending on the team you're practicing with, maybe not as much. And yes, we try to keep our hand close to the chest in terms of what we are going to bring, but it's nowhere near the extent that we would go before WTC in that sense.
Yeah, sure. So, just to allude to WTC, so how long before WTC will you like sort of shut up all communication and try and keep that information secret? Because, I guess what you're saying, and what I understand is that information is so pivotal that your, I guess, WTC game style play or run, you want to shut things off. Like the information of your army list and stuff like that is more important than getting extra practice with it. So, I guess, so long story short, so how long before WTC would you shut off external scrims?
I think it's a very flexible decision to make in terms of team prep. It's a delicate matter, as you've said, because it is basically removing the practice that you also need with the list, with the armies that you're building with. I would say basically after the newest iteration of rules. So if we have any kind of data slate before WTC scheduled, if we have the last codex that will make it to WTC, I think after that it's all about developing the team in the closed group and keeping it close to their chest.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, doing internal scrims, all those boot camps, as you were alluding to, and I also understand that last year, like you sort of had like a very closed team event where no list was shared and stuff like that. So, doing some stuff like that along the way. So, I guess like to sort of deep dive a bit more about that. So, I know I think it's pretty open knowledge. Like Team Australia as a whole, they generally actually don't like the idea of like international external scrims because they believe they don't gain much out of it, whereas others gain more of it than they do. Like how they do pairings and how they do list development, stuff like that. So I guess for you guys as Team Poland, why do you think it's a beneficial thing for you to maybe share how your pairing strategy and what your army lists and archetypes are, and maybe like other countries like your competitors like Team England or Team Scotland or Team USA to learn how you guys operate?
So I think for us, the most important part of doing these scrims is not only having the incredible tool to pick an actual 8-man team for the WTC itself, which is like this tool in that role is incredible. Like you have the possibility of test a newer player against an established WTC veteran, right? It's something that doesn't happen ever so often, and now you can have plenty of these throughout the year. So as a tool of selecting the players, I think it's unquestionably amazing at that. There is definitely the possibility of we are sharing something, but also widening our backend, so to speak. So Poland is still a relatively small community of players that usually know each other pretty well. We don't have a huge scene. So having the basically developing the players for next years is a huge part of that. Sometimes you would have a player who is not good enough to make it this year, but having seeing his dedication to these scrims, for example, seeing his performance, we might offer him a coaching position for this year and like communicate with them that we know that they have the right mindset and possibly they just need to develop some more to make it for next year's, right? So what we are doing in practice is widening our player pool that we can choose from for also next year's. It is something that is crucial to us, as it has been the case that if something like 7th edition hits, like end of 7th edition, when the 40k almost died in practice, that some of the players that, for example, have been playing for years and years might not be there for the next year, right? So having that wider pool of players to choose from is a huge for us as a whole community and as building this team for future, not only looking at the just this year, for example, right?
Yeah, sure. So I guess just to deep dive that more and make sure I understand it correctly. So for you, scrims are way more important in developing the player or players and how they perform on an international stage rather than testing an army. Because look, obviously testing an army is important, but you could probably stress test that more internally with great, I guess, value practice. Is that my correct understanding? Like they're both valuable, but testing is more important for you.
Yes, I think I would agree with that
Yeah.
generally. Especially like we have been doing streams, as I've said, since November, October, and I mean WTC is in almost a year by then, right? We are talking 10 months. The game is going so drastically change in the 10 months that treating these as WTC practice per se and testing the armies for WTC is not realistic in that time scheme with the frequency of updates that we have currently, right? So, yes, I would say developing players, testing them out, and like developing them as a community as well for the actual WTC practice is also huge. Something that I would like to touch upon for sure, as I think it's interesting, is the fact that, as I've said, after, for example, the last data slate before the WTC, we would shut off external scrims. So now we are left with the internal group of people that we have the opportunity to test with. And scrims also allow us to develop that group of people. It's not only 8 players going to WTC that are quintessential in making sure that we are as well as prepared as we possibly can. It's also people that didn't necessarily make the team, who are coaches, who are prospects, and they are faction specialists. Sometimes they are playstyle specialists. They are also great people who will help us develop lists, test them extensively, and make sure nothing catches us off guard.
Yeah, exactly, and that's great. So like you develop that internally and externally as well. So yeah, that's awesome, and makes a lot of sense. And I know that's it's a Team Australia approach. Is like they just develop everything internally because that's what they think they've got the quality of players and the depth to do so. So that makes complete sense.
I don't. I just
You're
wanted to touch upon this. I don't think there's a single answer for team building. I'm gonna be honest. I don't think there's a correct position in this. I think it's very dependent on your community, on people that you have available to you. So it's a whole thing. I don't think I don't necessarily consider not doing scrims being wrong in any sense as well.
Yeah, it's just a different approach, right? Like, I guess in real life sports and esports, like every other team has a unique approach. Like, do you try and develop a team of friends who are like good together and they play just in harmoniously, or do you just get the biggest, I guess, pieces of shit almost to an extent, but they're very good at the sport they do, and look, and sometimes that works. And I know, like, it's a unique philosophy and approach, right? Like, it depends on how you want to do things and what you represent as a club, or in this sense, I guess, a team or a nation. So it's interesting. There's no one size fits all. Otherwise, we would generally all play that or do that thing. So it's an interesting discussion, and it's definitely something to build upon. And yeah, each country does things differently for sure. So and each captain has their own reigns, I guess, or I guess community to sort of influence things. So, but anyways, that's another whole philosophical discussion. We can we can avoid that for now. So I guess I want to sort of iterate and touch upon during a scrim and stuff like that. So will you sort of practice quote unquote scenarios? So what I mean by that is, for example, so obviously using an example of a new player, will you sort of say, hey, in this matchup, yes, I know in real life, like it's currently right now we're winning the round or things are going well, but we want you to go push really hard and see if you can 20 this person or get a big score and like sort of recreate a scenario where you need to push, or say, hey, can you just hold a bit even though you have the opportunity to push? Will you recreate those scenarios for the players or just let them play their game?
I honestly don't think that happens much.
Yeah, okay.
What we would, especially the fact that the scrims in their like own nature don't happen. All the games don't happen at the same time, and in that sense, it's hard to recreate that 8v8 in-person event, right? Where everybody's playing at the same time and the information constantly fluctuates and changes and is passed on by coaches. Instead, you will have people play a week before other people play. So they already know their scores. They basically almost can know what they need to achieve to score before the game, what they need to score to grant us a win, a draw, or whatever. So I don't think that usually happens. What we focus on instead is making sure that the estimation tables are as close to reality as possible. And it is one of the most, if not the most difficult task, in my opinion, in all of 40K, getting your estimations correct. It is also the most crucial in, I believe, winning a team event. So the goal of each player is to score what they have estimated, basically, right? And before then, we would sometimes go over our estimations and assess each other's estimations, saying things like, I don't think that's true. I think you are missing something in this army that you have estimated green against, or as a positive matchup. I think it actually rinses you. Maybe let's play a test, right? Let's play a test game. Let's learn something. So the goal of each player would oftentimes, as the most important, would be score what you have estimated beforehand. It's very hard to design a situation where you'd come on in the middle of the game and tell a person to push, for example, where they already know a score of different games that have happened, right?
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. I guess would you maybe save that for like internal scrimmages potentially, if you're able to like recreate the scenario you're all playing at the same time and the opportunity was there? Would you try and recreate that then, or even then it's still a bit hard because maybe like contexture is important?
I think context is definitely important, and it's still hard to do. But yes, sometimes we would have those situations, for example, of rather than, I don't know, specifically telling a player to push, we would ask if he thinks it's a possible. Do you think this is a good matchup for you? If so, what would you do if you had the opportunity to play this game again, right? In the same scenario, maybe we would just reset the game and try a different approach, for example, going ham instead of playing more defensively. And then a player also has a possibility to show us, or show the selectors in this case, that they are able to do something like that, to adapt, kind of, right? But before you know the matchup very well, it is almost impossible to do that kind of gambit. I would say these kind of very specific scenarios that you like tell people to perform, let's say pushing for a higher score, is something that you can only do when you have the matchup you are extremely versed in a specific matchup in your army, in your opponent's army, and you are very comfortable in it. Otherwise, it is all kind of on and off, and it's testing the waters most of the time.
Yeah, sure. Okay, that makes sense. So I guess another question. So to deep dive a bit more on this scenario discussion, as we get the guest appearance on Pumba's cat, which is a guest appearance
Always,
100%,
every
always,
single
every
time.
single time. So in the gameplay scenario, so I have sort of a like a two-part question here. So with like so in say in an actual scrimmage, like internal or external, look, we've got a 2-inch charge, or sorry, a 3-inch charge, and the person rolls a double one, CP rerolls into another double one. Would you like fix that scenario there and say, look, you guys just make the charge in a external or internal scrim, or would you just like play it as it lies? Or with like things which are likely or unlikely, would you fix those results at all?
A very difficult question to assess. It's very dependent on a specific game, what we want to learn. If this is one of the earlier testing for a matchup or for a player, something like this, it definitely sometimes happens. I think two days ago, we had a one of our practice games internally, which basically would end rather, with 2 failed 4-inch charges, right? And if that happens, where it definitely changes the outcome of the game to be a beatdown of a 20-0 beatdown, and we basically know that what is going to happen now, I think it's worth amending that game state in a sense. We also learn in this situation that if you fail those 4-inch charges, for example, the game is a 20-0 no matter what. It's also information that's very valuable. Another case might be, okay, this is a kind of failed game state. You have the situation where you no longer can win the game because something incredible or ridiculous happened. Sure. Let's see how badly this will go, because we actually don't know, right? So this would be like presenting a situation where we can actually, in a sense, stress test how badly the matchup can possibly go if you now try to scramble for points, right? So situations like that can be also an asset to know in practice, like how good a player is in scrambling after something horrible has happened to them. 2, how good a player is in pushing when they have the opportunity because opponent like dice screwed your opponent. And 3, what is in practice the lowest score you can achieve when playing a scramble game. All of these can be very useful informations to have.
Yeah, sure. So I guess you iterate in an internal scrim, you may like do 1 of 3 scenarios, but in an external scrim, like say you're playing obviously against Team Scotland per se, would you advise your players to say, hey, just let them have the 2-inch charge, or just play it as it lies because it's a bit too hard? It's a very slippery slope.
Yeah, I think it never happened so far from in any games that we've played. As you alluded to, it's kind of a slippery slope because what's a failed state, right? It's very much matchup dependent. It's very subjective. What like is a roll that is horrible? Like, sure, you needed a 3-inch charge. You roll a double one, roll to a double one. That's obviously fucked. But these can happen so often in games of 40k, and these are so subjective as to how badly like this screws me up, that would be quite impossible, I think, to assess them.
Yeah, sure, exactly. I think that's a very fair statement. Like in your internal games, like yes, you can maybe recreate scenarios that fit it, but in externally, like it's just a bit too awkward and maybe like not enough nuance. Like if a Satan just fails a bit more 4-ups than it makes 4-ups, or vice versa, that good old Custodes player rolls more 4-ups than he should have, like you don't try and go, nah, you only make 50% of them. Like
It's a
even
very
though the math,
that's an incredibly good example, I think, because
yeah,
like Custodes or any 4-up Invon army, in my experience, is the army that will sometimes just roll your saves well, and you cannot realistically do anything about it. So this is a possibility for a player, as I've discussed previously, to like test how fucked it can get when opponents just refuse to fail a 4-up invuln. Right? That's a good example of an army that does that sometimes.
Yeah, or like those shadow field saves for the Archon, or like a 2-up invo.
Oh boy.
It's either the first one or like a infinites down the line.
Yep.
So it's
Sure thing.
it's funny scenarios like that. So that's good to know though. Like it's good to understand like where there is or isn't something. So I guess a question I have is when you get like a new player, and I guess maybe this is part of the stress testing per se, would you sort of coach them or teach them to try a different play style or a different army? I think different armies are pretty easy example of yes, but say you have a player who's traditionally that old school Art of War method of I sit in my corner, I score my points and keep it very close, and like I'm very good scrapper of scoring 10-10s and keeping it tight. Would you try and get them to start pushing and learning to, I guess, get those 20s, or not really per se?
I actually don't think that has ever happened. I think there's stages to the selection process. It must be known, right? Like sometimes at first it's an open selection. You kind of open the floodgates and let anybody that wants to apply to the national team, for example, and then you would like them to put their best foot forward, as you say, right? So you want them to present with the best they can actually do with their playstyle, their army, their ideas, stuff like this, right? So they present themselves as a player. Then you might like switch an army, have them test something else, develop their playstyle for a bit. But I don't actually think that we have ever told anybody to change up their playstyle completely. I think having these kind of roles in a team is quite natural, and you just need to account for them while picking your players. For example, I am definitely more of a defensive player. I am not someone who is very comfortable in pushing 20s, and so I don't necessarily often play armies that push those 20s, right? And it's something that just is my trait as a 40k player, and that's fine. So you have people who are more comfortable with such things, less comfortable, they have their own play styles, and you just work, often than not, you would just work around them while building the team comp instead of necessarily changing the player's play style, right? They have come to the selection process, they have, for example, been picked, they have been included in the 16 players that are doing the final stretch of the selection process. There is a reason for them to be here. They have shown us that their playstyle works in practice. Why change it now, right?
Yeah, sure. I think that makes sense. But you just got to make sure they still do the right thing. Like, I think, for example, like yourself, as you said, you're a defensive player. We wouldn't just then last minute switch you to an aggressive and attacking army unless you thought you could do so, or extraneous circumstances just have led you there, unfortunately, due to one reason or another. Or obviously, Team Poland alumni Skark. Like, we wouldn't. My understanding from an external perspective is we wouldn't not give him a math army or something that does get 20s. We would. Obviously, we would give him something like that rather than a very melee focused defensive. I'll score 5 points because that's where he thrives, is in getting those big mathematical shooting army wins.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
He's a great example because he's been doing that for like 20 years and it's kind of working, right? So especially you have that example, you have example of such people in our community where they've developed the playstyle throughout the years and it's been working for like years and years. We don't necessarily see a reason for people to get pushed in other directions when their way is their way and it's clearly good enough.
Yeah, sure. I guess also, so post the scrim, so you've done your scrim against Team Scotland, the results have stood. What will you generally do with the team afterwards? Will you both go over each other's pairing matrices and see how you guys evaluated things and get a sense for things, or will you generally just go on to the next scrim?
So we try to have a little bit of a debrief after each of one of these. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes, for example, scrims would not get finished because life got in the way. Sure, that can happen. These are scrim games, and sometimes there is more important things in life. But most of the time, we would try to get some. I'm missing a word. Like to actually get results and learn from them, to have like lessons learned or something like this. So we would analyze the pairings. We would analyze what went wrong in them, which estimations are probably wrong, which estimations are correct. Sometimes, actually, after the game that you've won, you might say this matchup is still fucked. I think, right? It can happen as well. So we would gather these in a like concise form and try to pick out like this is kind of externally, but within the team. And then, of course, it gives the selectors a lot of room to examine further, right, with their own like kind of view of how the players perform, how the armies are performing. So it's kind of a different tool for players themselves, for somebody who's captaining the team, and then it's different for the selectors themselves.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. And I guess like during that debrief, like most I guess good teams do, is they'll analyze and say, look, yeah, I think it's still a favorable matchup, but maybe the mission skewed the data, or the table pick wasn't right, or it was maybe or it was more beneficial because of the table pick or mission and stuff like that. So it's good to understand and debrief. And then if you can get that external information from, say, Team Scotland, who said, look, actually, this is a very favorable matchup, and the results show that. And with further analysis, you do such. Like, it's good to know. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, that's actually a great point that you've brought up, which I kind of forgot to mention. We usually exchange the estimation tables with the opposing team to also get that other view, like to understand what their goals were in pairings, where our information or opinions deviate. Also, a great learning process.
Yeah, awesome. So we have a question. So the question is: so is there any interesting nuance? So is there anything interesting about, I guess, scrims per se that you found? Oh, sorry. Let me read the question properly. Sorry. Is there any interesting nuance you found to getting the most out of scrims beyond the game themselves? So it's a bit of a weird question, but is there anything, I guess, external that you try and do to get the most out of scrims? Rather than just playing the games themselves. I guess maybe they're sharing the estimation tables and talking about things beforehand, but is there anything else that we hasn't come up just yet?
I think so. I think after doing so many of these, I find something that is not very apparent at first, but it's becoming more and more apparent to me, is the value of these in developing how your players and players in general discuss their opinions of 40k. Because especially Teams 40k is not very data driven. It really isn't. There isn't a source such as StatHammer meta dashboard. It doesn't really exist. It's very much based on internal practice, on opinions, on very specific tools, or specific matchups, or specific tech. It's still not data driven, so you will have divergent opinion on the topics. And I think it's hugely important for your team to be able to discuss them, to actually gain something through them. It is kind of like if somebody tells you, to give you an example, because I think it's very esoterical, but in practice it will become more apparent what I'm trying to say. Say you estimate your pairing against an enemy, I don't know, guard as a green, right? Then your guard player from your team says it's absolutely never a green pairing for you because this, and this. It's very hard for you to kind of feel personally attacked in that position, right? It happens a lot. It happens actually a lot where you would there is disagreement in opinions, and it's very hard for these to get quite intense. There's egos involved, there's skill. These are potentially two very skilled players that have achieved a lot in 40k in general, and they need to come to a conclusion, and their opinions diverge. And I think during these scrims, it is a great opportunity for the whole team to learn discussing things. because I think it's crucial for people to be able to do that. And of course, the main separator kind of is, let's play a test game, sure, but realistically, you are never going to test every single matchup for every single army before event. It's not realistic. It's not with 40k, not with the amount of time you need to actually play a game 40k. So these discussions to have like a meaning, to be meaningful, to have to draw some conclusions for them, I think is a huge like benefit for players to do this on a regular basis and learn to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, and that's some great insight. So, and I think also to add on to there as a bit as well. So, the result of one game doesn't dictate also a whole pairing matrix. Like just because, so for example, in that guard example, say you get the green per se, and like obviously it's good to get results driven, I guess, things like, yep, I got the green, I got the good results, but then maybe future games are yellows or oranges or actually detrimental results, and you just had like an outlier per se there because look, sometimes you just win a game. So it's important to also reflect and go, hey, just because I won this one game doesn't mean for all future games are going to win it. Like the mission, the terrain, the player, the list. Like there's so many different variables that affect things. So maybe that guard play is correct in a sense, but sometimes the results don't show that.
Yep, exactly. So
Yeah.
it will oftentimes be opinion based still instead of data based or like test based. It is a matter of fact. And I think having developed, this is one of the biggest things I think we have developed as Team Portland during these scrims, the ability to actually gain valuable information from each other in terms of our armies and our opinions on matchups to actually come to a conclusion. And let's not beat around the bush, testing is still crucial. Like you won't solve everything by doing like discussing things and stuff. Getting reps in is incredibly valuable. Getting tests in is incredibly valuable, but due to the nature of the game, it's not possible to test every single thing every time.
No, exactly. So, I guess to allude to this stuff, so obviously having good discussion, we've talked a lot of big positives about scrims as a whole. Like, it sounds like an amazing process, and obviously there's good reasons for such. Are there any big negatives or cons to doing scrims that you found, Pumba?
Honestly, the time investment. As with everything in 40k, you have limited time for your hobby in a sense. So these are something that we invest time that we could have spent otherwise, in a sense, right? Doing maybe internal scrims instead of external scrims, stuff like that. We have just come to the conclusion that it is the best use of our time, especially in that selection stage leading up to WTC. So it's kind of a conclusion of ours that it is definitely worth it, and the time spent is time well spent. But sometimes just life gets fucking hectic, man, and sometimes you're just like, how the fuck do I squeeze another game of 40k this week, for example, right? So
Yeah,
it's just time consuming for everybody involved. It's for the captains, for the people who are selected for a given scrim, stuff like this. So I think this is the biggest drawback. But that's basically everything in this hobby. So you pick and choose.
yeah, exactly. So, and like as an example, like what you said before, like sometimes you organize a scrim, and 2 weeks later, life gets in the way. Like the two players who I'm sure sometimes maybe it's the most interesting matchup. It doesn't happen where like life gets in the way for one player, then it gets in the way for the other player, and unfortunately, the interesting matchup which you were most keen about doesn't happen. So, whereas maybe like in a practice game, that would happen instantaneously, so you would have that information. So that's all right. It is what it is. Again, there's no perfect world. There's always going to be pros and cons. So yeah, I think that's great though. So thank you for that, Pumba. So before we wrap things up, so Pumba, I know you've recently joined the Enter the Matrix crew on Stat Check. Is there any big final shout outs or plugs that you wanted to have?
Yes, definitely. I would like to shout out all my StatCheck boys. All the shows on the StatCheck network are amazing. We have the main show, we have the XN one, we have newly acquired Take All Comers, who have some of the greatest West Coast US players in the podcast. huge fan of them, especially Lucas, who beat my fucking ass at WTC. So I'm very excited to have him on the StatCheck crew as well. And of course, Enter the Matrix, which is mine, Typhus's, and Nathan's show that we are very invested in. We'll be doing some coverage of the Pyro Cup after it happens in 2 weeks, possibly exactly 2 weeks almost. So check us out and join the Patreon of StatCheck if you would like to have more content and a great community to discuss things with. And of course, follow Team Poland on Facebook. We try to post as often as possible. If you would like some quality Pyro Cup coverage, because the event, of course, will have a lot of national teams, we will be posting a lot of stuff there for our viewers and fans.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm a patron of StatCheck, and I love it so much. So there's a lot of great shows there. So highly encourage anyone to join there. And I know, apologies, I don't know if it's this week or next week. I know the Contact Lost Boys, so obviously another Polish crew. They're doing an interview with Zerka, so the captain of Team France this year, and then Anthony Vanella. So if you want some pre-Pyro Cup coverage and then get some post-Pyro Cup coverage, there you go. You've got it all sorted.
Exactly. So you go to the Contact Lost Boys for the pre-Pyro coverage, and then you come to us after we actually have won it.
Boom! You're calling a shot now. Have you got it in the bag, Pumba? Like, you feeling confident?
I'm gonna be honest. It's so fun to have this event coming. I have not been excited for an event this much for a long time. It's this and Alpine and the WTC, which I think are the greatest events coming up this year for me. I kind of feel like I have my groove back on. I'm like choosing a team composition and doing all the preparation for an 18-man event is a huge benefit. And also, it has this WTC vibe for sure, where like everybody's kind of trying to be sneaky and like pull something off. But at the same time, it doesn't have the stakes of WTC. So there's a lot of shit posting and banter, and I love every second of it.
Oh, mate, I'm just waiting for like the call out videos and like, the diss tracks and the raps and stuff like that. I can't imagine anything better than some nerdy dudes just trying to rap like they're, I don't know, Tupac or something like that. So
there is a reason I have this tag over here, because somebody from the StatCheck crew, wink wink, is bringing some World Eaters to the event. I already know this, which is basically trolling, and I'm like making the point here.
Look, some short kings just, I don't know, can never get off the bandwagon, so it's okay. We love him, buddy. So awesome. So thank you very much for your time, Pumba. I know you've been a very, very busy man. I really, really appreciate it, and I look forward to meeting you one day and talking to you again soon. So thanks for everyone for listening. All right, bye-bye. Take care.
Goodbye, everybody.